a wonderful food. That was a real treat. We'll give people just a minute to kind of get back before we get started. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started and let people settle in as they come back. There's a couple things that we want to do this afternoon, and I'm going to try to talk as little as possible because I know that if I just keep on talking, you're going to fall asleep after lunch here, and so I'm going to have to keep you kind of engaged in this so that I'm not just up here talking to myself. So anyway, I want to kind of finish up a little bit on this interpersonal peacemaking skills that we started in on just before lunch. I want to talk about some the difference between debate and dialogue, and then that will lead us into the next two sessions where we're talking about what is conflict like in the church? How do we characterize that? What are some of the issues that we should be paying attention to? And then we want to finish up the day by doing the role play, the organ dispute, as we call it. And coming up with an agreement of procedures. And I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to work through that so that we kind of get a good feel of what that might look like. So I want to start out by talking about what's the difference between debate and dialogue. And I have to say that we're updating this manual, the CTS manual, as we call it, the Conflict Transformation Skills Manual, and we're adding a couple of pages in here. One of them is this page on dialogue versus dispute. We're also doing the one about the green beans, the extraordinary versus ordinary harm. We're adding that. So you're just kind of getting bits and pieces of that, kind of a foreshadowing of that, because we feel like those are really important parts that are added to, that we need to add to this. This manual was put together, I don't know, back in the early 2000s, and it needs to be updated. So some of these numbers that you see on here, the C2, don't exactly correlate with what you see in your book, but it does relate to those pages, so you can follow along in that way. We're also adding a page on agency and how people gain agency, how I'll talk more about that when we look at power and powerlessness. But I want to begin here by talking about dialogue versus debate. And so somehow, maybe one of the ways that we can think about this, is using those metaphors in a debate, like you're really kind of butting heads, like you're trying to win the argument. So it's this idea of maybe these military metaphors that we use really kind of characterizes when we think of debate. And maybe dialogue can be this dance metaphor, like how do we interact with each other in a way that we're responding to each other in a more positive way. So we're just going to go through a number of differences here. So in dialogue, the goal of dialogue is to increase our understanding of the other person. So I'm really sitting down and trying to understand, your perspective on things, where you're coming from. Where in, debate, a successful debate is trying to win the opponent over to my side, like for them to see my side. And if I can do that, then I win. And so it's this kind of dialogue is trying to understand. Debate is trying to convince the other person that I'm right. In dialogue, I listen for a view to understand. I'm really trying, to open up, that Johari window, trying to expand that open space so that I can understand why you might be responding to the way that you are. And in debate, I'm listening with a view to counter what I hear. So I'm not listening there to try to understand you. I'm listening so that I can refute what you're trying to say. I'm trying to, I'm trying to convince you that I'm right and that you're wrong. So we might be listening, but why we're listening is very different. In dialogue, I listen for strengths so as to affirm. So, this is where these name tags might come in handy. And of course, we don't all walk around with name tags all the time. You're red, I understand why you do that. But it's like, I can maybe understand that person. And that's actually a strength. That's important to understand. It's maybe my blind spot, but I can understand why that person might be approaching things the way that they are. And in debate, I'm listening for weaknesses so that I can just say, yeah, but that really doesn't make a lot of sense. And I'm trying to discredit them and discount what they're trying to say. And so, again, it's a very different approach or reason to why we might be listening to each other. So this idea of listening to each other, you'll find this in your manual in C3. So typical listening responses, we might, if you turn to page C3, there are a number of typical, what we call typical listening responses. So sometimes we're advising, why don't you just do this or do that? We try to give people advice. Or we're judging. Well, don't get so uptight, just, loosen up a little bit. That's not a very constructive attitude, we're judgmental. Or, well, what's really bothering you, this is maybe where blues would come in, where they're analyzing what's really bothering you is this or that. Or we question, why did you do that? That was stupid. I don't understand why you did that. Or even we might think that we're supporting, don't worry about it, just trust yourself, you'll be fine. And often people don't really want advice, they just want to be heard. They want people to listen to them. So I'm sure that all of you have done these kinds of exercises where you give positive feedback to people. We like to mix this up a little bit. And you're going to find a partner, and I suggest that it's not well, I guess it could be your spouse, but maybe not your spouse. Find someone else. And think of something that really, really irritates you, like something that really bothers you. For me, it's, I think it's the same here in Pennsylvania. You can turn right on a red light, right? And this is my red coming out of me. I'm fine with that, but it really bugs me when I see someone, take advantage of that and pull out in front of someone else and makes them slow down. Not just me slow. It bugs me when I see them do it to someone else. So that's definitely my red coming out, and I just get so upset at them. And I say, like, who do they think they are? That they're so much more important than that other person that they make them slow down. Like and my wife says, like, why do you get so upset at that? And especially if it's a semi, if they make a semi slow down, it's like, and I just think, they're arrogant and conceited and, the whole ball of wax. And so that kind of thing, like what's something that really peeves you? So think about that. And then with your partner, I don't care who it is, tell them about that. And then the partner, instead of giving good feedback, give them some of this negative feedback. Like, well, why don't you just, or don't get so uptight. Like, give some of this kind of negative feedback. And then do that for about a minute, and then turn around and flip roles a little bit. The other person talk about something that you're peeved about, and the other person give this kind of typical listening responses. So we're not really, maybe some of us are used to giving that kind of feedback, but most of us, are more restrained than that. But then take a little bit of time between the two of you and just talk about how it felt to receive that kind of feedback and how it felt to give that kind of feedback. So we'll take like 5 minutes to do this. Find a partner, start telling them about something that really peeves you, and then the other person, and this may be really stretching some of you, that's fine, I understand that. I don't know how well I would do that, but try to give some of this kind of negative feedback to the other person. So 5 minutes, round the clock. So does
Don't say that on tape.
talk about
I'm
not
not
what you're upset about, but how did it feel to give that kind of feedback? Anybody? How did it feel to give that kind of those kind of responses? Bad, thumbs down, uncaring. So when you're receiving that, like you just feel like you're not even being listened to, really. Yeah. Okay. Don't really care. Yeah. Yeah. Silence is killing me. I gotta talk. It'll be okay. Yeah. You'll get over this. Yeah. They need to invest in attention. It's not malice. Yeah. It's just the lack of what to say. They need to do something. Yeah. We have this impulse where we have to say something, right? And so we say something that's not really helpful. And very good. Yeah, back there. Just like the people I'm complaining about. Just like the people we're complaining about. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it's a little awkward to do that because most of us don't talk, unless we're in that situation, I just don't know what to say, so I gotta say something, and, maybe say something that's really not that helpful. Like, on the flip side of that, it doesn't, the person that's kind of receiving that, like, yeah, you're not hearing me, you're not really listening to what I'm saying. So it's kind of that, more maybe positive response. Well, can you tell me more about like, that, or, asking them to talk more about their, why would, what happened that, to get them to kind of talk more about it, rather than just kind of, well, it almost feels like you're cutting them off, right? Like those kinds of responses, like, okay, I've heard enough, let's move on to something else. Okay, so back to, we've done that. This idea of dialogue versus debate. In dialogue, I speak for myself, for my own experience, for my own understanding and experience. In debate, I speak based on assumptions made about others' positions and motivations. In other words, I think I know, why you're doing that, and you're kind of, you're responding to others rather than just kind of speaking out of your own experience. In dialogue, I ask questions to increase understanding. In debate, I might ask questions, but I might do so to trip you up. I don't know how many lawyers we have in there, but this is kind of what we do as lawyers, right? Like, I ask you questions to kind of like, why did you do that? Like, to get them to kind of, double up on their story and, I caught you, like, that kind of thing. Like, but if we're really in dialogue, like, we really want to understand the other person. I don't know how many of you were like in debate.
Okay, I have a million questions to ask. What color were you?
I don't know if they have debate club anymore or not, but, in debate club, like, what do you have to do in debate club? Like, when you go to debate, you don't know which side you're going to argue, right? So you have to be able to argue both sides. And I've been thinking about this, like, do I know the other person well enough that I could argue their side? And that, to me, that's a real challenge. Like, do I know them well enough that I can make an argument for them? And it doesn't mean that I have to agree with them, but I know what they're, where they're at, where they're coming from, their experience, why they're saying this, and I could actually, fill in for them if their seat were empty. So really trying to increase our understanding, not just to trip people up, but to understand them. In dialogue, I allow others to complete their communication. Like, we don't, if we're in debate, we might interrupt, or we want to change the subject, which kind of gets back to this unhelpful responses, where we might give a response, but really what we're trying to do is move the conversation on to a different subject. And in dialogue, I concentrate on others' words and feelings. In other words, I really want to understand why, throwing the green beans really bothered you. I want to understand that. And in debate, I'm more focused on my next point. I just want to move on to the next point. I don't really care your emotions, your feelings about this. Let's just move on. In dialogue, I accept others' experience as real and valid for them. This gets back to this idea that we all, we see things, that we can all look at the same thing and see things differently. There are a couple really good movies that address this. There's, forget what the one is called. It plays this moment over and over again, and then it plays how different people saw that same event from different perspectives. And it's like, oh, you can only see this in one way, and then you see this other perspective, and oh man, I never thought about that. You know, and it's really revealing. In dialogue, I critique others' experience as distorted and invalid. Like, well, there's no way that, you know, what you felt or saw could be real. Like, because I saw it too, and I know what happened. Well, different people can see the same thing in different ways. In dialogue, I allow for the expression of real feelings in myself and others. What understanding and catharsis. Sometimes we doubt ourselves, right? Like, you know, maybe what I have to say is really valid. But we kind of have to believe that, like, you know, sharing my story can be healing. Like, we need to allow ourselves space for that to tell my story. And in dialogue, I express my feelings to manipulate others. I deny theirs as legitimate. In other words, we really, you know, I might tell you something, but I'm really trying to kind of manipulate things so that you might see things my way. I'm not really interested in just hearing or telling my story. So this is another exercise. I don't think we're going to spend time doing this because there's other things that we want to get to, but this is maybe kind of small, but this whole idea of being able to kind of paraphrase and then repeat things back. So someone might come up to you and say, you're very inconsiderate. Why don't you get help to clean up? Why didn't you come help clean up the classroom? Or what if somebody comes up to you and says that, you know, they kind of take you off guard? Like, how would you respond back to them? Like, I can see that this really upsets you, and I understand that. You know, in the future, I'm going to, you know, maybe try to, you know, pay attention to what's going on rather than just being off and doing my own thing. You know, what's our first kind of response to something like that? You're very inconsiderate. Why didn't you help me clean up the classroom? Didn't you need help? I didn't know you. Oh, yeah, you didn't know you needed help. Okay, yeah. Defensive, which you might say something like, whatever. Not my job. Or, you know, no one ever asked me. But sometimes we're really quick to say, I'm sorry, right? And that can be one of those kind of not very helpful responses, like just a quick I'm sorry, like, but trying to understand people a little bit more than just kind of, well, I'm sorry, and kind of getting off the hook, but really trying to understand why this upset the other person. You know, I can see you're really upset. I didn't realize that, you know, you needed help. You know, can you let us know the next time that, you know, you need help, and we'd be glad to help. But often people just want to kind of, you know, respond quickly with "I'm sorry, I didn't know," or something like that. Anyway, we won't spend a lot of time with that. This is another example of that. What we want to do now, again, this is just, what are we at as far as time? Yeah. We're going to do this, and on page E2, this is another E2, and in this case, you're going to pair up in threes this time, and this is the janitor and the trustee are having a little bit of a go around. So the janitor, the trustee has some issues with the janitor. The janitor's been working hard. This is their second job. They're trying to make ends meet. And the trustee is concerned that, some things aren't getting done in the church, light bulbs aren't being done, the drinking fountain hasn't been working for, a couple of months. Why isn't that fixed? The janitor just isn't doing their job. The janitor feels like, they don't know when there's meetings in the building, nobody lets them know, and they're expected to clean them up afterwards. There's just not much communication about what they should be doing. And they're having a hard time doing everything that people are asking them to with the amount of time that they have to work. And so, get in groups of 3. The third person will be the mediator. So you're going to have to decide in your group who's going to be the trustee, who's going to be the janitor, and who's going to be the mediator. Maybe you won't need the mediator, but if you get to a point where you're saying, we really need someone to help us work through this, then you'll call in the mediator to help you kind of get each other, to do some listening, to help each other talk through this, to see if you can come to some solution. So we'll take about 10 minutes for this. So again, find groups of 3, decide who's going to do it, take the time to read through it, and then, and your goal is not to be really obstinate here. Like you're not trying to be, a real jerk. You're really trying to take that role and work through a real issue. And someone said, like, we did this in a church down in Atlanta, and the person says, afterwards says, I thought I was supposed to be a knucklehead. And, your goal is not to be a knucklehead here. Your goal is to really kind of practice these kind of listening, these dialogue skills that we talked about, and work through kind of getting down to those interests that you're, what's the interest of the janitor? What's the interest of the trustee? And how do you arrive there? Okay? So you have about, this might take a little bit longer than the other ones. You might have about 10 minutes, about 1:53.
A major, I can change, but certainly I would be capable of changing, adjusting the fountain, so that it doesn't squirt too high.
So,
But
what are
I'm
some
not
observations that
to
you
do a
have as
major
you
overhaul.
found yourself working through that? Anyone? Yeah. You were talking to civil man? They were? Okay. Good. Yeah.
When we started asking, understanding types of questions and to understand what was going on, her defensiveness went way down.
Okay.
She began to increase her.
Yeah, so the defensiveness went down as the more that you talked. Which one of you was the trustee and which was the janitor?
The trustee, she was the janitor.
Okay.
He was the
Mediator. Yeah, well.
Yeah, as the trustee, I was maybe a little too accusatory of the situation.
Wasn't getting things done, was she?
I was the mediator.
Oh, you were the mediator. That's the janitor over there. He wasn't getting things done.
I quickly pointed out to the janitor Nelson that all of these things were in his job description. Why isn't he getting them done?
What was the comeback?
It was I did my best, and if you give me a little more time and a little more knowledge, maybe I can make this
And
work.
maybe even some help.
Yeah.
Okay, I just saw him back here.
We didn't back down. I don't know, we were talking, but I
relying on the mediator to step in because I was the trustee and I wouldn't take anything that she said. She was blaming me and I was blaming her, and
Okay.
so we needed the mediator to help us, but we were not really conciliatory.
Yeah. So you got into that blaming mode. Okay.
I thought that's what we were supposed to do.
Yeah. No, we said not to be the knuckleheads.
Very out of character of Laura. I admit it was hard.
What? Yeah, we're here.
I was just gonna say, I was with the yellows, I was forgiven immediately.
But go ahead and repeat that again.
I said, I was with the yellow, so I was forgiven immediately, vindicated, loved.
Yeah. So how did the conversation shift at all when you began to think about, like, well, how am I functioning here? What might the other person be thinking? How is that, did that affect the conversation at all? Yeah.
Well, when our mediator stepped in,
It's for the people online, they can't hear it.
when the mediator stepped in and gave us some great suggestions, it did change.
Mhm.
I did change the role playing there and said, well, that was a good idea.
Yeah.
Mrs. Mark.
Okay, I taught English and I'm really sensitive to words, and I think everybody else here probably, even though you didn't teach English, the word janitor just hit me wrong. I don't think we say that anymore because we denigrated the position and denigrated the word. And so when you make your edits, when I put my red pencil through the word janitor, I think, maintenance personnel, something like that would make me feel better.
Very, very good. I think that's a great point because that all of a sudden evoked something in you right away, and the other person might not even think about that, right? And so just understanding how a word can trigger certain things in certain people, it means something completely different to one person than they do to another. Very, very good.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that both of the people that were role playing, the trustee and the janitor, both of them felt that the janitor was inferior. The trustee kind of was, they were joking around with each other, and I'm not going to repeat what they said, but there was a feeling from the trustee that the janitor was inferior to him, and there was a feeling from the janitor that he also was inferior to the trustee.
Mm-hmm. So there's some power issues going on there. Anyone else? Yeah, Joel.
One of the things that we pointed out was that maybe the story is deeper than what is on the piece of paper. And there are legitimate things that have to be looked into when it comes to employee-employer relationships. Is the job really getting done? So for instance, it doesn't say that there was a schedule posted on the wall 3 weeks in advance for this person to be working on. Maybe that was the case. And I think so that there are things that have to be unfolded.
Exactly. There's always a backstory, right? And we don't know all of that backstory. Yeah, so you can see how, we can really kind of, I was looking at how people were even kind of positioned physically, how they were, some of the yellows were just kind of laid back and, laughing and having a good time, and some of the reds were, they were really we got to, you got to get your work done. This is what, the list says you're supposed to do. So there's different, even the way we position ourselves physically tells us a little bit of something of how we're going to go about that conversation, maybe. All right. I think we're going to switch gears here a little bit and move towards conflict in the congregation. So what we like to look at is not just specific issues or specific content, but what are our attitudes towards conflict? And we talked about this already, like, do we have this kind of negative, like, is conflict, if we have conflict in the church, does that mean that we're a bad church? Well, maybe not. Maybe it just means that things are getting done. And things are moving along, and there's kind of differences of opinion of how that should get done. So it's not, we have this kind of gut reaction, maybe how we even do to the word janitor. When we hear the word conflict, like, well, we have this kind of preconditioned response that comes up in us when we hear that word. And so, well, we're, a bad congregation. That's not necessarily what we're talking about. Like, what are our attitudes when there are differences among us of how things should happen? And so we want to begin by looking at that a little bit. So, I'm just going to go over this really quickly. There are two sheets on your table, on each table. I think they're on each table. There should be a yellow one and a blue one. Are they, there you go, okay. So everybody has a yellow and a blue one. The one says, one says destructive, the blue one says destructive conflict patterns, the other one says feelings of powerlessness. The first one we're going to work at is the blue one, the destructive conflict patterns. So this is in your manual. You can kind of go through here. I'll just go through some of this really quickly, but I want you to spend time thinking about first preps. Like, what are our attitudes towards conflict? And I'll just go over some of these really quickly. So you can see this diagram, like, you can really kind of position yourself in a conflict. Like, so this, I was telling my table at lunch that during COVID, my church that I pastored up until the beginning of this year, during COVID, they meet in a really old building. It's a beautiful building built back in like 1867 or something like that. And it had kind of become run down, and COVID was like a perfect time. Well, some people thought it was a perfect time to restore it. And people just kind of tore it apart. And then it came time like, well, we might be able to meet together in a month or so. How are we going to put this back together? And it created a real conflict. And so there were, you could characterize that conflict in a couple different ways. So some people, the issue of, say, carpeting, represented by over here on this side, the red circles. So maybe family A, B, and C thought, well, we should have carpeting. D, E, and F said, no, we really need to restore the old hardwood. And then something else came up. Well, we need to do something with the nursery. And, maybe A, B, and C thought one thing should happen, D, E, and F thought another thing should happen. Something else came up, A, B, and C thought, this, and D, E, and F thought something else. Well, what you see happening is people aren't really lining themselves up on the issue. They're really lining themselves up. Well, these people think that, And so I'm gonna think that as well. So, and it's really how it played out in our church, because there were like three distinct groups. It was the church was affiliated with both the Mennonites and the Church of the Brethren denominations, but it had also this really old, not old family, but family that had been lived in this area for, they brought the original land patents from the United States government. So this church, like this was part of them, and they weren't Mennonite or Brethren, and they inevitably all thought, lined themselves up in a particular, side, and the other people weren't quite as clear, but still kind of took these lines. So it was this older family kind of positioned against the Mennonite and the Brethren. But they didn't really talk about the issues. It was more about, well, our family thinks this and we think this. And they didn't really take personal responsibility for what they thought. So this other church another church might have, a certain people might have thought one thing about the hardwood floor, the carpeting, and other people thought, well, we should have, the other. But on each of those issues, it wasn't who stood for what. It was like, this is really how I feel about that, so they could have a conversation. But often churches kind of line themselves up like, these people always agree on this thing, whatever it is. It's not about the issue. It's like, well, I'm agreeing with this group of people. So those are some things that, kind of can characterize, is your church really kind of bound by conflict? This on your right side, where, these are things that we talk about together, or is it divided by conflict? Like you're really kind of split down the middle and you always take the same line. So thinking about, is First Press, when things come up, is it a church that's bound by conflict? We're working at this together. We have different views of things, but we're listening to each other. Or is it, a church divided by conflict? Like this side always agrees and this side always disagrees with this side. And that's the way it always is. And so we're looking for patterns, not necessarily like what do we think about this or that. That's not really what we're after here. We're more like, how in the past have we dealt with their differences that we faced? Have we been kind of divided down party lines, so to speak? Or is it more complex than that, where, well, one time I might, have a different opinion than Dave, but on the next issue, he and I might agree. And so it's not that I have anything against Dave, it's just that we see things differently on this issue. Next time, we might, we see things the same. It's not that I don't get along with Dave, it's the issue that we're really kind of focused on. So there's a list of things that kind of oops, I'm on the wrong way here. You'll find them on D1, where it has a list of different things that characterize a church divided by conflict and a church that's bound together by conflict. And I won't read through those because they're in your book, but I want you to take the blue sheet and work through that and think about patterns. Are we a church that's bound by conflict, or are we divided by conflict? So, I'm going to borrow your. So it says, identify conflict patterns in your congregation that tend to divide rather than bind. Use as your guide the left column on D1 in your conflict transformation skills with church's manual. Choose one person to serve as group facilitator and another to serve as a recorder. So one person, you can do this at a table, you can do this as together. So one person should kind of facilitate your conversation. The other person is kind of writing notes down here. And so down below, identify some of the patterns that you see in First Press here. And try to talk about that question. Are we divided? Or are we really kind of in this thing, we're committed together? And yeah, we have differences, but we're committed to really talking these things through. And not just, I don't want you just to focus on a specific issue, though that may come up. But I'm really interested in our patterns. How have we dealt with it in the past? Have we worked through it constructively? And you can make sure that you read through those, because that's really important to note those different aspects. And I have them on the PowerPoint, but they're also in your book, and you can just read through them. So we're going to take, back in the back. Both the left and the right-hand column, I mean, don't just focus on one, like what are some patterns that you see? It says destructive patterns, but I want us to also think about what really characterizes us. I don't want us just to focus on just the negative things. Okay? And again, we'll take about 20 minutes in there, because this is a really important conversation to have among yourselves. To continue talking about this, I noticed this conversation wasn't quite as fun as maybe some of the others that we've had up to this point. I noticed kind of the fidget toys coming out a bit more as we were talking about this. So anyway, we want to save these, and we'll come back to them in the small groups and so forth, and reference. So don't toss it in the waste paper bin. So we'll just kind of, anybody have anything to say, just offhand, like, not necessarily about whether we have conflict or not, but like, what was it like just talking about this? How did it make you feel? Good? Good. Maybe talk about some things that we don't normally talk about with each other as much. Expand, good. So we're going to continue down this vein a little bit. I'm going to talk about feelings of powerlessness in a congregation. Why do people feel powerless? Some of us might not ever experience this, and others feel it all the time. Like we have this whole idea of we just assume that the word janitor is kind of a neutral term, but for some people, like just using that is already creating some disparity that that a lot of us don't have to think about. And so, what are some of those things why people might feel powerless? What are some of the indicators that people are feeling powerless? And what are some of the common ways in which people are left feeling powerless in churches? And in some ways, I shy away from using this term because, again, I think it's one of those terms that's kind of loaded. People don't want to talk about it. I like to talk about this in terms of agency, because I think that all of us have agency. And agency is simply having some self-determination in what happens. Now, we all have that in varying degrees, but we can, I like to think that power is kind of like currency, and we all have a certain amount of currency. And so some of us have currency because of who we are. As a white male, I have currency. But what I do with that currency makes a big difference. And I always say that the preposition makes a huge difference. Like, do I have power over people, or do I have power with people? And I think that makes a big difference. Like, how I choose to use the currency that I have makes all the difference. Some of us have, currency when it comes to music, right? I don't have much currency when it comes to music. I love music. I love to listen to music, but boy, you don't want me trying to keep a beat or a tune or anything. But I'm sure that there are people in here that have a lot of currency when it comes to music. And so our gifts bring us currency, right? It's kind of our expertise. If I want to know something about organs, I'm going to go to Joel because he's worked on, or Tom. Okay, either one of them. Learn something about. So, all of us have certain currency and how we use it. Sometimes language is currency, right? I get made fun of. I'll just never remember this when I was in grad school at Michigan State. I used to get made fun of so much of my, I guess it was my Dutch accent. My professors would just like right in my face make fun of me. And I get really upset about it. But it was like there's this certain gatekeeping of like what proper language is. And so in a church, like I'll use the church that I pastored for a while. You had the Mennonites and the Brothers, which were really kind of educated in proper church language. And then you had this local family that, for one, they weren't highly educated. And boy, you could not get them to pray or anything in church. And it wasn't that they were capable, it's just that they didn't feel like they had the right language. They didn't have that kind of holy language to use in church. And so they didn't participate at that level because of just, and Europe is kind of notorious for this. Like there's kind of the official language, and then you have all these kind of vernacular languages. And if you want to be in politics, you have to be able to know how to use that official language, or you have no place there. But it can also flip, right? So if you're from a certain region and you know how to speak the official language, and you go back to your home language, you slip back into slang again. Because you want people to think that you're part of it, that you're part of them. And so, like, we use these kinds of things as what I say currency to gain people's respect and so forth. And so, all of us are, constantly interacting with these, negotiating and dealing with these different levels of power and navigating our way through that. How do we manage that? And how do we do that in churches? And I would say, I'm just going to mention some things because there's a yellow sheet that I want you to work through. One of the things that I think is really connected to, that's important to think about when we think about powerlessness is the whole issue of unfulfilled hopes. So all of us have like unfulfilled hopes. Like I thought growing up I was going to be the shortstop for the Chicago Cubs. It was just a given. But that's not all in my control. Even if I would have been good enough, like I would have needed enough breaks, avoided enough injuries, enough things to be, one of the very, very, very few people that play at that level. It wasn't just in my control. So all of us have, maybe somebody wanted to be an astronaut, like, yeah, that's, shooting for the stars, but some of those things are not totally in our control. We all have those kind of unfulfilled hopes. But there are other things, other hopes that we have, like we might have hopes for this church, and if we feel like we're not being heard or things aren't being done the way that we think, like we really feel kind of a sense of powerlessness. And the word despair comes from the Greek word I have to look it up here. It's to basically be hopeless. When we despair, like we feel like we have no hope. And that makes us feel like we don't have any control over what's happening. So the idea of powerlessness is this sense of not having any hope, not having any agency, not having any self-determination of the outcome. And so I'd like to go back to just one specific thing that we talked about earlier in the day. Well, in fact, we talked about it last night. We talked about how sometimes people become silent, and sometimes the only currency that people have is being silent, like withdrawing from the process. And that's the only way they feel like they're going to be heard, is by being silent. And so we might think, well, why is that person doing that? Well, that's the only currency that they have, is like withdrawing from the situation. And so, it's not just about people exerting power in unhealthy ways. That's part of it. But all of us have a certain amount of currency, and being in tune to what's happening, rather than just, well, this person has power, this person doesn't. How are those two interacting with each other? And how does that help us understand what's happening in this situation? And so people people might feel like they don't have any say-so, so they'll, well, they're not coming to church anymore, they're withholding funds, or, this is a way to kind of have some agency, right? You're not listening to what I'm saying, so we're going to do this. Maybe you'll listen to that. So, we have, I really like to use the word currency, and that there are markets within the church. There's worship, there's fellowship, there's mission. And these are all markets, and we all have some kind of currency in that. Some maybe more in some areas, and some less in that area, but others maybe more in other areas. And we use these, and it's not necessarily good or bad, it's just the way that we function as people, and understanding why people might do the things that we don't understand. So it's kind of another added layer, like we have these name tags, but it might also indicate like social standing, gender, generational differences that all create different kinds of currencies in different settings. So, again, if you turn to D3 and 4, actually, D3 and 4, there's a list of ways that, down at the bottom, ways that church systems commonly make people feel powerless and invalidated. And I'm just gonna go through this list right here. You can read through that on your own. But I want to go through, like, so sometimes, so people can use their currents in passive ways, or they can use it in active ways. And so sometimes people will, just be stony silent. When they feel like they have no agency, or they'll boycott meetings, they'll leave church, they'll have indirect communication, they'll begin to triangulate and such, or they'll withhold money, and they'll finally just kind of withdraw, and kind of withhold any kind of input into anything. And then you have kind of more active symptoms where people will walk out of meetings. And I had this happen when, in the church when we were trying to figure out how to renovate it. People would just walk out of meetings. I couldn't believe that people would do that. They refuse to engage thoughtfully, like they'll say mean things to each other rather than really kind of talking about issues. They'll threaten others, or they'll do committee stacking, and this happened in my church. So we had a board in the Mennonite church. There's a board of elders rather than a session, and each of the members makes up. It was a head of the worship and fellowship and trustees. Well, somehow this family got 3 people onto the board, and they were all in the trustees. And so that's a lot of power, right? So this idea of stacking committees to sway people in one direction or another, or mystery votes. We already talked about this earlier. And then this personal attack on others. So we can, you can be passive in a way that you respond to feeling a lack of agency, or you can be kind of more aggressive the way you go about it. So, can you hand me the yellow? Thank you. So, in this exercise, identify feelings of powerless that you may experience within the congregation here. Use as starting points D3 and 4, which we talked about. Choose one person again to facilitate another person to jot down your comments. The recorder will make those comments on the sheet. And again, we want to save these as we move ahead from today. So again, we're going to take about 20 minutes and we're going past break here a little bit, but that'll leave us enough time then to do our final piece in the afternoon. We'll go to 3 o'clock, and then again, you're going to want to spend some time talking about this around your tables. So talk about how this plays out here in First Pres. Come out of your group.
Okay. Anyway, I think we need to communicate better and do some healing.
I was surprised to hear that possibly the divisions on the church are between the session and the congregation.
We have 3 in our group, and none of us could come up with any feeling of powerlessness in the church. And my take on it is that we come with low expectations to have power.
Okay.
We're part of the congregation, and we come for whatever the activities are, worship service or others. And I suppose if you're on certain committees and maybe you chair a committee, that's a certain amount of power, but otherwise we're not looking for power.
Yeah. So in other words, it gets back to this thing of hopes, right? Like So your hopes are kind of being fulfilled. Yeah. So we're gonna take a break here, and we want to come back at, we're running a bit behind, but let's try to get back here at 3:15. We'll have 45 minutes to wrap up, and we're gonna need most of that time just to do this final role play. But I think it's really important to think about, what does it look like to put together a decision-making process, or not necessarily a decision-making process, but how do people's voices be heard in a process like that? So go get a drink, use a restroom, whatever you need to do. Try to be back here by 1:15, and we'll jump right back into it.
Cool.
So if you turn
And how that was a way to a place to communicate.
Sure.
And how I missed that until
There's a sample agreement
attending the
on
men's group with your
procedures
dad
here.
and other people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a vehicle for
So
dealing with stress.
I don't really like the example here, but it's what we have to work with. So there's a question about voluntary service, and I'm sure this must come out of a Mennonite congregation versus paid service in the congregation. Should people get paid for the work that they do, or should everybody just volunteer their services? And so, how do you go about making that decision? So you set up some goals to understand the implications of voluntary service versus the implications of paid service, and to find God's will for the issue. So what are some of the issues? Well, some people might really need, the money. Other people might not. Those are some issues you might take into consideration. Two, to provide opportunities for members of the congregation to express their views on the issues. So you want to hear how people feel about it. To develop a proposal resolving the issue that is acceptable to as many members of the congregation as possible. So, it's really difficult to get everybody to agree on everything. But how do you hear the voice of the congregation? And to discuss the issue openly, tolerantly, and flexibly in a spirit of Christian fellowship. It's not just about individuals, but it's about us as a congregation. How do we work through that as a congregation together? And so there's a timeline that's put together. So the church council creates an ad hoc committee, and they present this agreement of procedures that is then kind of ratified in some way or another. Presbyterians have their own way of doing that kind of thing. Different churches have different ways of doing that. And so they create this timeline, October 1st to 29th, the congregation discusses the issues. During this time, all the members will have an opportunity to state their views and to suggest solutions. October 1st, there's going to be a panel. October 8th, there might be a guest speaker that talks about it. October 15th, there's small group discussions. We fill out a questionnaire during the evening service. There's another ad hoc committee to review the results. October 29th, there's a brainstorming session, and so on and so forth. So there's this kind of process that you thoughtfully put together to make sure that people are heard and that what they say is somehow recorded in some way. And then there's, on December 3rd, they present a final recommendation to the quarterly congregational meeting for official action based on previously gathered information. And then there's a decision rule. So how's the decision get made? Well, in this case, they have to have 60% vote to pass it. I'm not suggesting that this is the way to do it, but this is an example of how you might put something like that together. We did this with 2 congregations in Colorado this past year. There were two large congregations, and both of them were growing older and asking the question, like, how do we move forward? Well, the one church was asking the question, the other church hadn't really arrived there yet, but they were kind of like 5 years behind the other church. And the first church said, you know, we're really going to, in a couple of years, we're going to be non-existent. And we don't want that to happen. We want to stay together. And if we, and it was Presbyterian churches, they said, if we dissolve, the money's all going to go back to the presbytery, right? And so we don't want that to happen. We want to maintain those resources and allow other people to benefit from them. So they look, how can we merge with another church? And so they began an inquiry with another church. And of course, the other church was a little bit hesitant to begin with. And so we put this process together where, you know, we did, I think we did a healthy congregation workshop. Jay and I went out and we did some listening sessions, and people from both congregations were sitting and they were talking to each other and said, oh, I didn't realize this, or I didn't realize that. Oh, that really changes things. We thought you were just trying to come take over our church. You know, so those kind of misunderstandings were kind of laid to rest. And we were really kind of tentative, like, you know, this might not really work out. And we didn't have any interest in going one way or the other. But both congregations, they decided in this decision rule that both congregations had to have a certain amount approve the merger. And we thought, well, the one church, you know, they might get 80%. The other church, boy, we don't know if we'll get over 70% or not. And so the day that they had, the Sunday that they had determined to take the vote was the Sunday after Epiphany, just this past year. And when they took the vote, the one church was like 96%, the other church like way in the 80s. Like everybody was just floored, but we really kind of credit it to this process where people were listening to each other, and they were not at the same place in this, but as they sat and listened to each other and understood each other, they're saying, oh, you know, this might work. Now they have a lot of work to do after that. Like what does that look like? How do we, you know, what does a merger look like after that? But just getting there, this kind of agreement on procedures was really helpful in them getting to that place. So we're going to give you an opportunity to do something similar. If you turn to pages E3, and this is what you've all been waiting for, the organ dispute. And you'll have to read through the background to it. And there's this question, like, should we get a new organ or not? And, you know, just ignore the costs in here. I know that we're really out of date here. But, so you're going to need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I said 8. Yeah, maybe you have to reconfigure and go to 6 at a table. Or figure, maybe you can have 2 people serve as, let's just stay, oh, I lost my back. Oh, there I go. So just let's stay in the tables as we are, and just decide who's going to play what role. So you'll need a facilitator, a neutral person to keep things moving along. You'll need a recorder. who's a trusted member of the church, a person representing the leading families favoring the pipe organ, persons representing a group opposed to the pipe organ, persons representing the music committee, persons representing the finance committee. So you can double up on a couple of those representatives there. And so there are different roles on each of these pages. So there's the E3 through E6 are identical, except at the bottom, you'll find your role there. Those favoring a new organ, those opposed to a new organ, the music committee, and the finance committee. So read through the case there, and then whatever role you're taking, just read through that role. Don't read through the other roles. So you're coming at this, again, from a particular perspective. Either you're opposed or for, or you're from the finance committee or the music committee. And again, the goal isn't to be the knucklehead here. Sorry to use that term. Like you're actually, like you have differences, but you're trying, like, how do we talk about this together? You're not trying to decide whether you're going to buy the organ or not. That's not what you're working at. What you're working at is putting together an agreement on procedures to make sure that people's voices are heard. Okay? So you're not making a decision. You're putting together a process of how you would make sure that people's voices are heard in this decision. What does that look like? What are some goals? So what are the timelines that you might go about listening to people? And then what does a decision look like? What does a determination look like? Okay? So we want to take until about 10 till to work at this. That may be cutting short. Yeah, that gives us 20 minutes. I think we can finish up with what else we want to do the rest of the day. I might give you a little bit more time than that. Maybe we'll go till 5 till. Let's go till 5 till, and then we'll come back together. So, have at it.
So what do you do?
What are some of the elements?
Use the old people.
Our
Use old
first
people.
steps were start with a congregational meeting. Our first few steps, it's not on. Our first step is to turn on the mic.
I guess this one's not gonna read.
Go over there.
I think I'm now on. Our first few steps went as such. We were going to start with a congregational meeting open to everyone, just to announce the fact that we are considering the purchase of a new organ. And also to say that our next step will be to have the music committee doing research and meeting with several organ manufacturers to research pricing and find out what exactly is involved, including future maintenance. Our next step is then going to be also forming a committee specifically to look at the purchase of the organ that is not the same as the music committee. We want to make sure we have a wide variety of voices throughout the congregation, not only the people who are specifically interested in music. Then, after the fact gathering process, we'll present the people that we think are potentially interested in donating a significant amount of money to see if they are on board, what their concerns are, and what their commitment might be. And then we would go back to the congregation with that feedback in hand. If we do think it's a viable thing to research further, we'll go back to the congregation again and present, and that's where
That's as far as we got.
Okay, good. Yeah. So making sure that people have a way to express their concerns or their interests is an important part of that, yeah. Anybody else want to quickly report? So you kind of get the idea, like, you know, what does a process look like for a congregation to make some kind of a decision? And I like, you know, that you're communicating with the congregation, right? You're letting people that, well, we're thinking about this, and we're going to make opportunity for you to have, you know, some input into it. So that's kind of right up front, right? Like, it's not, well, you're halfway through it, we've already made a decision, we're going to let you say something, but the decision's already been made. Like, right up front, you know that things are, that something's happening, and that you're going to get a chance to speak into it before a final decision is made. So that's kind of the idea. So, yeah, I think it's important, like, that we find ways, you know, when important decisions are made, how do we listen to the voices in the church? How do we set up a process to make sure that that's heard? Well, it's been a lot of fun to be with you today. We're at the end. We're going to do one more thing here. We're going to go back to our spectrum and place yourself on the spectrum. How well do you think you're doing at the things that we've talked about today? Listening, speaking, understanding other people, understanding maybe where other people. How well do you think you're doing in that? And, you know, you can be kind of lighthearted about this, but kind of owning some of, like, you know, well, maybe I need to work on that. Maybe I'm down at a 4. I thought I was all the way up at a 9, but maybe I'm down at a 4. You know, maybe I'm doing better than what I really thought I was. Maybe I'm not down at the 2 or 3. Maybe I'm up at the 6. So up out of your seats and back on the spectrum, kind of place yourself. Where do you think you are in a lot of these things of trying to listen and work through differences when you have differences with people? Okay?
There's a couple folks who were here today who were not here last night.
Okay.
So can you just give?
All right, so back in front of the food table, there's some tape set out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Just place yourself, in this case, how well do you think you're doing in the things that we talked about today? You feel like, yeah, I've got a good handle on this. Yeah, no, I recognize that there's some places that I really need to work on. Where would you place yourself in that spectrum? 1 is I need some work. 2 is like I've got it all together. Or 10 is I got it all together. Personally. Yeah. Personally. with accessors.
I think one of the things is just to remain, you have to remind yourself sometimes of things. You know, like I was saying before, you say something because you don't know what else to say. To catch yourself and remind yourself, oh, hold on, and constantly kind of reevaluate things in your head before, you know, as I call engaging out in programming and all of those. But I think that's something when we go through the process, especially the listening process, it's not to be real quick, jump in. The silence on your part, if you're the listener, is often the best.
So this recognition that, yeah, just being able to recognize that maybe I need to work on this. The positive thing, right? Maybe just be more self-aware. It's okay not to have it all together. None of us are good. We all have things we need to do. Process, things to sharpen our tools, also other goals that we have. But it's a reminder, sometimes it's just remind yourself. Yeah, I knew that, I know that, and sometimes we forget that. Well, I enjoyed this so much. We're going to do one more thing. Let's create space for somebody else. Everybody's in the circle. So, I'd like to just take a little bit of, give an opportunity for people to say, make some statements of appreciation for each other. I forget that I'm a red, but I really kind of, I really appreciate that. But to get more personal than that, like I really like what Rick did, or just the time to offer some statements of appreciation. Yes.
I really appreciate all pastors for having to deal with so many different colorful people.
I was on Zoom the first meeting. I wanted to think about Jan. You do all this. Starting as Christ do that, knowing everything. But knowing I want all of us to recognize that there are a lot of people who are not here. I want us to leave here thinking we receive that we got.
I would like to recognize, I guess you'd say, or have us recognize our diversity and celebrate our diversity as opposed to whether we like it here. We we say it all the time, we're a congregation, diverse congregation. I think we need to look at it more as a celebratory thing.
I'd like to celebrate being in space again.
I'd like to celebrate Ron and Rick about leading us through this discussion on
I actually want to thank everyone for participating. Some of you may have been both here, they won't be here. That's what I appreciate that. I just like to close Dear God, we're grateful for this congregation that you have placed here in Allentown, for its witness, for many years, its faithfulness, its willingness to engage with each other, to hear what we have for them in the future. All of our lives have been disrupted, past a couple of years especially, and we just ask for your spirits to take vision for this congregation as they move forward together. Christ.
We have rules of leftover food that has been carefully packaged, so first come, first served on that. And if you can help bring whatever's left on the table up to the stage, that would be great. And finally, another thank you for your time. Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Got it.